risk takers and they're wanting to leave their mark on the world and all these different things. That's not what men 20 to 25 are in this day and age at all. They are meek, they are afraid, they are avoidant, they are low confidence. And it's very clear to me that there is an endocrine factor to this. We cannot solve lifestyle issues with medications and hormones and peptides and drugs, but those are a lot of the times the things that people are trying to solve for.
Testosterone gets a rap for just building muscle or as sex, but I get probably the most satisfying benefits of treating guys and gals from a mental standpoint. It just almost gives them their life, their vigor back. It kind of takes off the parking brake.
I would describe it as spinning around on an office chair 50 times and imagine being in that state for years perpetually. It was pretty hellish, I would say.
All right, Landon, hit the disclaimer.
So Dave, thanks for coming on. I've watched your stuff on the TRT and Hormone Optimization channel, I don't know, since 2021, probably around in there. And then I really came to know your work from listening to you speak at Silverback on 2023 was the first one I went to. And I still use some of the things that you said at that time. And so since I've kind of stole some of your verbiage on stuff, I wanted to get you on and actually have your words say everything. But I kind of just wanted to even know your background with everything. How did you get started, and just kind of give a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for having me. And it's great to hear that my analogies and all of that stuff from those speeches has resonated. I've been in this field professionally since 2019. I want to say maybe late 2018. And I was someone who never really thought I would be doing much with science at all. I didn't do science in high school past grade 10 because it wasn't something that you could really fluff your way through. You actually had to study. And that wasn't really my cup of tea in high school. So I was doing digital marketing. I was a musician for a long time. And long story short, condensing a very, long traumatic kind of period, I had a very severe brain injury, which left me with quite debilitating vertigo. And for people who've never had vertigo, I would describe it as spinning around on an office chair 50 times and imagine being in that state for years perpetually. It was pretty hellish, I would say. And after every doctor who I spoke to told me that it was incurable, that the vestibular nerve couldn't be healed, I decided to go back to university and get a postgraduate diploma in science, really focusing on biomedical science, and moved into a master's of neuropsychiatry to very quickly drop out, as I thought we would learn how to heal the brain, not how to drug people without question. But fortunately, from doing that period of study, and particularly looking at endocrinology out of interest when I was there, I was led to hormones, and in particular testosterone, as well as hormones like pregnenolone, DHEA, thyroid, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today. And the synergy of those with peptides and other nutrients in a hope that I would be able to heal the nerve damage, which was deemed incurable. And after I recovered from that, everything else that I was doing professionally, which previously was digital marketing, kind of felt very superfluous. I really wanted to help people, not just with similar conditions to what I was dealing with, but just navigate through the mess of dealing with multiple specialists who aren't talking to each other, people who are seeing each individual component of the body as separate, which doesn't make any sense. It's not how the human body works. And after doing that for a number of years, I ended up kind of progressing into education, progressing into writing a few books, working with a few clinics, mentoring on how TRT should be done properly from a biomedical standpoint, looking at the pharmacokinetics of how these medications deliver the optimal outcomes that we are hoping to achieve. And I've been doing that ever since. I've been fortunate enough to speak at a number of events and work with some amazing doctors and clinics all over the world. And that's led me to being here today chatting to you.
Nice. Where are you primarily located? I mean, I've seen you in the U.S., but you're not from the U.S. And where are your clinics, or where's your main source of action?
So I live in a country called Lithuania. For people who don't know where that is, it is north of Poland, west of Russia. It's the southernmost Baltic state, but culturally Eastern Europe, but technically Northern Europe, the Baltic states. I've been here for 5 years. So I have a clinic over here that's actually based in Latvia called TRT Baltic, and we service Eastern Europe. But I'm originally from Perth, Western Australia. And the majority of my business activity, clinical operations, and kind of everything I've done in this field has been based out of Australia. I was living in Australia when I started doing this. And I also work with a clinic in the US called Victory Men's Health. So my goal for a while has been to be able to have clinics all over the world, which I am working with directly on the clinical protocols to allow these clinics, as well as myself, coaching, to be able to have, what I would deem gold standard approaches applied for my clients who become patients of these doctors. So I'm kind of spread across Europe, US, and Australia, but I would say I'm primarily based in Australia business-wise, but I live over here in Lithuania.
Do you see anything different just from taking care of guys across the country? Like mine, I'm in Texas, and so really it's kind of niche to Texas, but obviously with the silverback being popular, it's kind of throughout the US. But is there anything that you observe that's even different management-wise in Australia or Europe compared to your US clientele?
Yeah, there's definitely difference. I mean, in the US, there's a lot more insulin resistance, that's for sure. In Europe, particularly in this part of Europe, vitamin D deficiency is rampant, as well as working with a lot of clients in the UK as well, but also in Eastern Europe. I see a lot more Hashimoto's. I would hypothesize that there is a degree of lifelong and in utero vitamin D deficiency that probably contributes to that. And in Australia, there's kind of a little bit of everything. I mean, too much alcohol, binge drinking culture is a bit of a global thing. There's different social conventions for how that shows up in different parts of the world, but that's definitely universal. Men are men in every country, so there is that kind of common template and patterns that come up. But yeah, there's different lifestyle components. There's different socioeconomic issues that lead to different health outcomes as well. There's different kind of focuses on different aspects of health and fitness in different countries. So there are some things that are a little bit different, but at the end of the day, endocrine issues are becoming a global, I would call, an epidemic. But there's probably more endocrine disruption going on in Western countries. There's things like glyphosate and atrazine, which are rampant in Western countries that are less saturated over here, sure. And we definitely have a lot less juvenile obesity over here and obesity during puberty. So I think that I've been saying for a long time that I think that is a big factor of why a lot of these younger guys are coming up with low testosterone issues due to obesity during development. But Eastern Europe is becoming pretty westernized. I've been coming over to Lithuania back and forth since 2014 or so, and there's definitely been a cultural shift. So the world is becoming more globalized, and that's kind of coming more as a kind of universal issue.
Okay, cool. Little sidebar, but really, I think you do a great job with all the psychiatric component and mental health along with the testosterone therapy. And so I wanted to kind of dive into those a little bit. I'll say from my own experience with testosterone, I mean, testosterone gets a rap for just building muscle or as sex, but I get probably the most satisfying benefits of treating guys and gals from a mental standpoint. It just almost gives them their life, their vigor back. And kind of in my own personal journey, I mean, I worked in the ER day shift, night shift for 10 years. And so I probably threw off my circadian rhythm. I couldn't exercise very frequently. And so like I gained a lot of weight and then I kind of yo-yo dieted. And so maybe I threw it all off from that. But anyways, I was struggling with kind of depression, anxiety. And I was like, let me try out the lifestyle stuff. I lost 30 pounds, took a good amount of vitamin D, stopped microwaving in plastic, changed all my fragrances, deodorant, shampoos, etc. So everything I could do, and was still kind of struggling with it. I randomly checked my testosterone level and it was low. And so I was like, I'll start testosterone if that doesn't work. I mean, I just kind of plan to go the typical depression, anxiety, med route, SSRIs and everything. Well, luckily testosterone fixed that and kind of got me back. So personally, it's helped me from a psychological standpoint more than anything. But what do you see and how have you helped guys with their psychological component with their testosterone?
Yeah, this is the subject that I'm the most interested in. When I first got into working with testosterone personally, and then as well as, as a coach, my background was more so coming out of the neuropsychiatry component. So when I was first looking at testosterone, I was looking at it through more of the lens that you'd look at things like everything from dexamphetamine and methylphenidate through to, SSRIs and other psychiatric medications. And when you look at how testosterone works on the facilitation of the production of neurotransmitters, as well as modulation of things like receptors and enzymatic pathways in the brain, I wouldn't say that it is the perfect psychiatric intervention for men, but out of everything that we have available for what I would deem, low-grade mental health disorders, I think that it's difficult to argue that it's the best, not maybe because it is the most efficacious in isolation, because all of these things require a holistic interventional approach in terms of mental health, lifestyle and psychological output and all these things psychological disposition are big factors as well. But the thing that I like the most about how testosterone works in the brain is that it doesn't force your brain into a certain direction. It works with you rather than works on you. It modulates and facilitates pathways rather than jacking certain things up for no good reason, which, when we look at psychiatry, I was having this discussion recently that the monoamine hypothesis of depression, this idea that one neurotransmitter is genetically broken in the people who are depressed, which is namely, deemed serotonin by the, psychiatric industry. This has been pretty thoroughly debunked, over the recent years in very big meta-analysis reviews, even in the recent years, all the way to simply comparing, SSRI antidepressant intervention with things like exercise. And not only do these drugs not work for the majority of people, but they cause debilitating, horrible side effects for more than 50% on average when you look at the SSRI class across the most commonly prescribed ones. So the interesting thing about testosterone in terms of how it works for mental health is that, I've been using the analogy for a while, is that it builds the foundation of the house, but it doesn't build the house for you. And what testosterone really allows you to do, without sounding too esoteric, it really is a male's life force. And when we look at how masculinity works, which, I know has become a bit of a buzzword in recent years in a bad way, but when I look at what masculinity is, if we look at the term alpha male, which again has been quite heavily bastardized, the alpha of a pack is simply the leader. So to me, masculinity is leadership, and leadership is to be able to make long-term goals and execute on these goals, but also to be able to be unwavering and less impacted by the effects of stress. Being cool, calm, and collected and driven forward under circumstances in which other people may become overwhelmed or crumble under pressure and trigger a fight or flight response. And modulating pathways like dopamine and GABA in particular, as well as offsetting for some of the negative effects of cortisol and adrenaline at a receptor level. When you combine all of these things together, but you also prescribe or encourage, depending on the role of the practitioner, things like good diet, exercise, healthy sleep patterns, as well as the importance of building character, pushing outside the comfort zone, all of these things which we know are important for building optimal mental health. When people do these things with low testosterone, they often don't really work very well. But when we do it in conjunction with restoring the androgenic environment internally and neurologically, these outcomes tend to be drastically beneficial, especially when mapped out over a long period of time. And one of the things that I like the most about seeing men, intervene in their life with testosterone therapy is seeing where they end up in terms of how their trajectory changes and who they become and what they build for themselves over a prolonged period. And that's been the thing that's been the most exciting for me to see in practice.
Yeah, I have a ton of guys who, I think were just, high achieving as young adults and everything. And then just life kind of catches up with them, where they, developed a business or, got through all their schooling and now they've kind of somewhat made it, had a family, and then they, they kind of fall back, they loosen up, they gain some weight, their sleep goes off, especially if they have kids and everything. And then they're just kind of backtracking a little bit, but there's still that kind of high performing individual in the background. And they know they're just not who they weren't once were, and kind of so that's where they want to be that high performing person, so they come and like, okay, well maybe the testosterone will get me back on track. And I will say a lot of times it gives them their life force, their vigor back. I mean, there's guys that I have that were like, yeah, I started a business and like I just kind of gave up on it, or I'm happy where I'm at. They get on testosterone and then they're like, man, I ramped up my marketing. I'm actively seeking leads, or they'll come back and a guy will come back in 6 months like, hey, I got a promotion, or hey, I left that job, I started the business. So it gives them that, it kind of takes off the parking brake, and allows them to drive at a full force and kind of lean forward the whole time. And so I've seen it be dramatic in getting their life force back and everything. And then you kind of talked about the masculinity, and that you have a big section over just the war on masculinity. And masculinity is positive overall, but it's kind of the mantra, which I'm sure is kind of cliche now, but it's be the warrior in the garden rather than the gardener in the war. But where does testosterone fit in this narrative with everything? Sorry, there's a big lead into a quick question, but how do you implement testosterone to get these guys their lives back and everything?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And when it comes to particularly speaking with younger men, and when I say what is young, it's basically anything that's a few years older than me, because I still deem myself as young regardless. But
Yeah.
when we're working with
Yeah.
men under the age of, let's say, 35, as a kind of ballpark, it can be very different for them versus working with older men, because when you're working with older men, let's say you've got a guy who's like in his 60s and he's got primary hypogonadism, and he wants to go back to feeling how he felt when he was 21. When you take these guys who are 30 who are hypogonadal, their worst nightmare is going back to how they felt when they were 21, because they've felt like garbage their entire adult life. And this is very different, because it's kind of like they're going through a second puberty, or they're going through a complete puberty, because they're finally getting that androgenic surge that they haven't had yet and that they should have had. And this is very interesting in how it forms the psychology, because I believe, from what I've observed, and also, I guess, what you read about mechanistically, I mean, this hasn't really been looked at in particular in a lot of research, but when men lack that androgenic surge when they're younger, when they're supposed to be at the peak of their, testosterone levels, when we're looking at stereotypes of younger men, men who are like 18 to 25, it's men who are full of testosterone. They're hyper sex drive, and they're driven, they're risk takers, and they're wanting to leave their mark on the world, and all these different things. That's not what men 20 to 25 are in this day and age at all. They are meek, they are afraid, they are avoidant, they are low confidence. And it's very clear to me that there is an endocrine factor to this. I mean, it's blatantly obvious. And I think once you're on the other side of optimizing your testosterone levels, you can see the forest. They say you can't see the forest from the trees. You can see the forest. You can really see and go, oh, this is a problem. And one of the examples I give all the time is that when I went to my 10-year high school reunion, I was looking at, I graduated in 2009, and I was looking at the graduating class is always the same age. So I was comparing, 2019 to 2009 to 1999 to 1989. In Australia, or in Western Australia, when you graduate, you're 17 years old. The graduating class of 1989, if there was like a battle royale between them and the 2019 class, I would bet every single dollar to my name on 1989 to kick their asses. It was like looking at a completely different breed of human. And so when you're looking at that, it's pretty obvious, but you can see it drastically in culture that there's definitely a lifestyle component to it, for sure. We can't just blame, the pollutions, plastics, and pesticides for everything. There's definitely a lifestyle component to it. But there is also a endocrine disruption factor to it. And I think that this is much more prominent in Western countries than in places like Eastern Europe, for example. But it is everywhere. And when we're looking at what testosterone can do for these younger men, it basically gives them the biological foundation that they were supposed to have. And I think it can be very psychologically damaging for the self-esteem when you're a young man who's been low testosterone his whole life, and you get to 30 and 35, and because you've been avoidant, because you've been, less resilient to stress, because you've been less driven from an internal factor that you don't really know that that's what's going on, it can be pretty damaging when you kind of look at your life and realize that you could be better, and that you are behind the eight ball in terms of where you know that you could and should be. And it's not from a lack of trying and feeling like there's something wrong with you, but then you go to the doctor and you're told that everything is normal because you're in some ridiculous reference range, and you just simply need an antidepressant, and that's the solution, which never, I wouldn't say never works, but doesn't work for the majority of these guys. And testosterone really allows them to get to where they should have been all along, and then go through the process of putting their life together. And, it can kind of be like playing catch up a little bit, but I think when you've got a good roadmap and good guidance and good strategies and processes that you can go through to expedite that process, it can be a real awakening and kind of like a metamorphosis process where these guys can go through different, lifestyle practices or behavioral modifications, or, all these kind of different things that you can do to really cultivate and drive resilience, and become, without sounding too cliche, become the best version of yourself possible, because you have the endocrine environment that you should have had that you've been lacking all along. So it, it's kind of like if there is a war on masculinity, this is basically picking up the sword. And, when guys look at testosterone or TRT as like cheating or anything like that, if I'm at war and there's a weapon on the ground, what, you think I'm not going to pick it up? Like, it's, if we're at war, like if we're in a sword fight and there's a shotgun on the ground, I'm picking that thing up. And the idea of not picking it up being more fair is ridiculous. So I think men should be very proud of seeking out TRT. I don't think it's something that should be stigmatized. And it's been really great since 2019. Like, when I started working in this field, people were like, what is TRT? What is a health coach? What is all of this stuff? It was something that no one had ever heard of. Whereas now TRT, particularly in the US, has become like a household term. Like, most people are familiar with it. It's been amazing to see more awareness grow, and it's been amazing to see the stigma slowly dying off. And I think in the coming years, it's going to be even more mainstream. And I think that's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, even my guys, like in 2022 was whenever I first started seeing my own patients. It was almost secretive. They didn't want people to know. They didn't tell anybody. Now I get much more, word of mouth referrals and everything, because now it's much more open. A guy can go to another guy and be like, look, what you're telling me is what I felt 6 months ago. I've started on testosterone and I feel amazing. One of the other things I just kind of want your thoughts on, and I don't think anybody has this info, it's just not, this is looking forward, but like, whenever I started my clinic, I thought my population was going to be like 50 to 70, and that was going to be my bulk of testosterone replacement for guys. But man, I'm getting legitimate, documented hypogonadal guys in their young 30s, their 20s. And so just kind of the epigenetic potential, like what are the offspring going to look like from a person with a 250 testosterone and compared with, the previous 700. We're already getting declining sperm counts and everything, but do you have any insight what your prediction would be this is going to impact our future generations?
Yeah, not good. I think it's scary. I think it is. I think that, my generation, so I was born in 92, and I often, joke with people that my generation are the outcome of what happens when, you wrap everyone in plastic, and you massively alter the diet to remove a lot of the micronutrition content, and then those people reproduce. And, looking at the next generation in terms of now my generation reproducing under a lot of these circumstances as well, I mean, it's just going to be the same thing that we're seeing in my generation, but compounded and multiplied. And I think that is a very scary thing in terms of, these poor young souls being, born into vessels which are broken in kind of fundamental ways biologically. And I hope and I'm optimistic about it because I don't like to be nihilistic, but I'm optimistic that our generation's shifting focus into longevity and health prevention and all of the things that have come out in the last few years and a big shift in people's disposition towards wanting to focus on health and longevity. I would hope that that is going to trickle down into the younger generation so that there is more of a focus on fighting back or undoing some of this damage that's being done. So I think without intervention, it's scary, but I also think that humans are pragmatic and humans are strategic problem solvers, and people like us will continue to spearhead this revolution of wanting the world to be a better place for everyone in it. And I think that this damage can be undone. And if it can't be undone at a societal level, it can be undone and corrected at an individual level. And at the end of the day, that's all we can really focus on, is what we all individually do for ourselves and for our families and for our children. So I think there is hope in a potentially bleak outcome.
One of the things I've stole from you is like, try and live like, you did whenever you went to your grandma's house, where you wake up early, you play all day till the sun goes down, and then you're so tired all day from playing that you fall asleep basically at when the sun goes down. You eat food that she grew from her garden, or grandpa shot a deer, and so everything was as whole food based as possible. And then you have the love of your grandma, so there's a community. It's like, I think that's pretty impactful, and something that I even try with. I have 2 kids as well, trying to make sure that we can get some of those days in, because I think those days are getting, it's so hard to have a day like that these days. Just everybody is so busy. Does even in the other countries, is everybody still as balls to the wall, go, go, go all day with everybody, with everything?
No, no. Well, over here in Lithuania, I can definitely say that there's a bigger seasonal aspect to it because we're so far north, we get really, extremes. So in winter, it's interesting. Like it's the opposite of what people would think. I mean, there's people who don't really care about what they're doing with their life, who tend to just become, alcoholics and overweight during winter. But for the people who are focused on trying to achieve things in their life, winter tends to be the part of the year where people work harder because there's nothing else to do other than become an alcoholic.
All right.
And then in summer, everyone's like, if you want to do Muay Thai, or if you want to, have someone come and fix something in your house, they're like, I'm going fishing. Like, leave me alone. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting over here how people are very strongly impacted by the seasons. But look, I think there's kind of 2 sides to it, since COVID in particular, but, I guess in the modern day and age of the technological revolution, the middle class is being destroyed. And I think a lot of people are overworking or pushing themselves because they want to be able to hold on to a standard of living and to be able to continue to live a certain lifestyle. That's becoming more and more difficult. But at the same time, I also think that with modern technology and working from home and, constant connectivity, you actually have to be disciplined in choosing when to switch on and switch off. And I see 2 types of maladaptations. I see people who have trouble switching on, who are naturally lazy. And then I see people who have trouble switching off, which would typically be type A people. And, these are people who on the outside are more externally successful. So, people can see this as a good thing, but they often tend to be internally tortured because they can't switch off. And this can be, perpetuated by modern technology. So, it is definitely go, go, go everywhere I've seen for a subset of the population. When I come to the US, I'm always impressed by the work ethic of the people who I'm hanging out with. Like, they make me feel lazy, which I think is great because it's always good to be surrounded by people who are high performance. But, there's that fine line, there's that balance. And, one of the things I really focus on in my life, my wife and I and my dog, we live out in like a national park. We live kind of a very secluded lifestyle. And I am very conscious of clocking in, clocking off. I've got a work phone, a personal phone. My work stays in the study. I don't take my work downstairs. And I think it's incredibly important to try your hardest and achieve, but I think it's also very important to recognize that you have to recharge your battery or you'll burn out, and also to spend time with the people that you love and care about, because otherwise, if you're working your ass off, unless you take time to smell the flowers and actually enjoy what you built, then you're really just basically a modern slave to a system. So there's a balance there. And I think everyone has areas that they suck at. I think everyone has areas that they maladapt in. And I think recognizing that and bringing your life into balance is one of the harder things that we all have to learn how to.
I'm going to switch to kind of more of a clinical aspect rather than the lifestyle and psych discussion. Well, it's still kind of psych, but like testosterone, I typically, especially in guys, use as, I would say, like a big lever, say trying to tune a radio station. It's the big one going back and forth. And then we do use thyroid, DHEA. Pregnenolone's probably our least used, but I say those are kind of my like fine tuning knobs, trying to get guys dialed in. Women are much easier to sell on thyroid, and they're like much more accepting. Guys, for whatever reason, don't really see the benefit of throwing in thyroid because it's not quite as sexy as testosterone. But also DHEA, pregnenolone, I use those guys in pretty history of like PTSD, like firemen, paramedics, police. They seem to have pretty good outcomes. DHEA, I can follow a level with the DHEA sulfate pretty good. I don't really have a good way to follow quantitatively on pregnenolone, but subjectively, and just from its mechanism of going from pregnenolone to allopregnenolone to helping with GABA, it can help with sleep and anxiety and everything. But very long lead into how do you utilize these, and do you track labs or symptoms, and how do you evaluate their effectiveness?
Yeah, that's a big question. So for background for people, my first ever lecture that I made, and it's still up. There's an orange Google Slides template that I didn't bother editing. And I'm sitting there in like a white shirt in the spare room at my mum's house. And I recorded a university style lecture on pregnenolone and DHEA. And this is when I was still, at university, because I was like, there's no information on YouTube on this topic. And I've combed through, like, there's like 43 citations in that lecture. So I thought to myself, well, I'm going to make the lecture on this that I was looking for, and maybe this will help other people out. And I didn't realize that would, kickstart a career in this field. I think that's, my most highly viewed video. And since then, I've written a book on it and done a masterclass, and all of that stuff's on YouTube. I think I've done a couple of in-depth follow-up lectures on it, everything from kind of short 101s to, kind of big symptomatic discussions and everything in between. When it comes to these hormones and pregnenolone and DHEA in particular, I often joke that I'm probably the most researched and published on these hormones online, and I use them very sparingly. One of the things that I've been saying for a long time with these hormones is that we can't just cherry pick the benefits of them, because they are so far reaching in what they do in the body. And if we cherry pick the benefits of them, they sound fantastic. It sounds like everyone should be taking them. But when people don't have an actual clinical deficiency in them, and we break the body's natural set point, they tend to just cause more side effects than good. And I've seen a lot of people try to, top them up with the minimal effective dose, and, use like microdose sustained release or sublingual or topical or whatever to try to optimize or work around the different pathways of metabolism that could be driving the side effects and yada, yada, yada. But the other thing that I will say is that if these hormones are deficient, nothing will make you feel right until that is corrected, because they are so integral in how every single system in the body works, not just the brain, but everything from the immune system, detoxification pathways, penis sensitivity, resiliency to stress, antagonism of cortisol, regulation of aromatase, regulation of receptors, like everything that it does. The thyroid is something that I have become more passionate about educating on. When I was at Silverback recently, I did a clinical workshop on focusing quite heavily on thyroid. I've just finished a thyroid masterclass, which will probably be up on YouTube when this goes live. People can check that out. And thyroid is something that I think a lot of practitioners shy away from, because I would argue that it's harder than all of those other hormones to optimize. Maybe it's easier to get it within a ballpark, but it's harder to get it to optimal. It requires more nuance, because you are working with a natural production that is volatile, but an exogenous dose that is consistent. So this is definitely more of a pain in the ass, and I think a lot of people just put it in the too hard bucket. But subclinical hypothyroidism is rampant all over the world, not just autoimmune hypothyroid, but whether it's secondary hypothyroidism from stress or whether it is endocrine disruption at a receptor level that is causing issues with the thyroid. A lot of people are dealing with a suboptimal thyroid and they don't know it. And the advantage of the thyroid is that supplementing with thyroid is a lot more forgiving because, it is annoying that you're dealing with the natural production being on, but the benefit is that you're also not suppressing and shutting down the natural production. You are using thyroid hormone responsibly. So when it comes to all of these hormones, it's been interesting to see the online discussion because for some reason the pendulum just has to swing to extremes. People can never just accept that the truth is in the middle, and they'll say, "Oh, well, it's not about labs; it's all about how you feel." And it's not all about how you feel. It's about a combination of the labs and symptoms. Otherwise, we just prescribe cocaine and Jaeger bombs, and everyone would feel fantastic, and we wouldn't care about the level. So, people can get kind of ridiculous with this idea that it's all about how you feel. Like, no, this is not it's not recreational drug use. It is about optimizing the endocrine system. So, and the challenge with thyroid is that hypothyroid and hypogonadal symptoms are virtually the same. Different emphasis on certain things, but very similar. So, with all of these hormones, it is about looking at symptoms and looking at optimizing endpoints for these hormones and their metabolites. And this is when it comes down to working with people on an individual level, and optimizing the entire endocrine system is difficult. It's something that sometimes things need to be done one thing at a time. Other times things need to be done in tandem in terms of not creating further imbalances. But yeah, at the end of the day, it is about symptoms and blood levels. And we can kind of deep dive on any one of those three if you like, and talk about the labs in particular.
Yeah, like, do you use free T3 as your like main marker? Do you ever implement reverse T3? And just kind of your insight on that aspect.
Yeah, so this was a big kind of subject of my thyroid masterclasses. I've seen some people say that reverse T3 is like a useless blood test. Every blood test is useless if you don't know how to interpret it. And I think the challenge of reverse T3 is that it's not really a medication. Well, I guess there could be in some circumstances, but it's not really something that you treat with a prescription. The the argument against testing reverse T3, which I can definitely agree with, is a good practitioner will be able to guess if it's high. Like if you're looking at the rest of the labs, the symptoms, and I guess the psychological profile of the patient, and you're looking at their lifestyle, sometimes running that lab test can be a bit arbitrary because you know that it's going to be jacked. But the real value of it, I've found, is being able to show to a client or a patient and say, here is an objective blood test marker to say that chronic stress is a problem, because everyone thinks it's not chronic stress until you show them a lab test and go, this is the issue. This is caused by lifestyle. This is caused by psychological anxiety. This is caused by all these factors. So reverse T3 being problematic is not a primary thyroid issue. It is a secondary issue where the thyroid is not the problem, but the thyroid is the symptom. And when practitioners who maybe have a bit of a Dunning-Kruger effect going on think that you can go, oh, well, reverse T3 is high. So if we give T4, that's going to convert into reverse T3. So we can just work around it by using T3 monotherapy. That's like saying, well, if we're pumping the brakes, we can just pump the accelerator harder and that will solve the problem. You're not going to have a smooth ride forward. You might have a jittery ride forward. You might solve one problem and create two more, but that's not a solution. That's just being lazy. So, reverse T3 issues are harder to fix because they require people basically fixing their maladaptive issues in their life, which is much more difficult than getting them to take a pill or do a shot. But it is useful in that regard. Free T3 there's not really one thyroid marker that is the most important, but if we were to say if there has to be one, I guess it would be that. The most important thing for me when I'm evaluating thyroid labs is TSH, free T3, free T4 all together. And I'm a bit old school. I like to look at waking temperatures a lot as well. I think that there's tremendous value in that in tandem with the blood work, not in place of blood work. Now, there are exceptions to this. If the pituitary is malformed, you've got things like empty cellar and so on, then that TSH-T3 feedback loop's not going to operate. But the TSH-T3 in combination, I would say, is the most important if we're going to be looking at a blood marker, because sometimes people do need to take the free T3 up pretty high to be able to actually resolve the hypothyroid symptoms, because there can be receptor blockade issues. And when the TSH-T3 feedback loop is functioning properly, that can be a useful marker, particularly when you're measuring peak and trough labs to see if further titration is required.
Do you use any micronutrients, vitamin D, magnesium, ferritin, or selenium? And then also, do you use low-dose naltrexone in any of the Hashimoto's patients or anything?
Yeah, great question. So originally, when I was working in this field, and I've seen so many people do the same thing as me, which is it's really nice to see other people come to the same conclusions, because it makes me feel better about myself. But I used to be of the mindset of being like, well, you should be able to get all your nutrients from food. You should be, but you typically can't, because the food is not typically high enough in micronutrients. So I am a big advocate of high quality, comprehensive multivitamins. I have seen all the fear-mongering crap about how multivitamins are bad for you and they're not effective at improving, nutrient status. That's just objectively false. I mean, yes, you can have terrible quality multivitamins that are cheap and nasty and not bioavailable, but I really like using a comprehensive multivitamin that covers all bases, because that is just what is the most efficient in correcting for micronutrient deficiencies. I would rather give someone a good quality multivitamin and top everything up, rather than testing for specific micronutrient deficiencies, because those lab tests are not particularly accurate, and a good quality multivitamin would not do harm for increasing those micronutrients, especially when, if we are using exogenous hormones, it can increase the requirement for those nutrients a lot. The two nutrients that you mentioned, which I think are the most important for thyroid, vitamin D and magnesium, which are typically not present in sufficient quantities in multivitamins, for good reason. I mean, you can't fit that much magnesium into a couple of capsules, and vitamin D is dose independent. But one of the most important things for thyroid response, even when using exogenous thyroid, is optimizing vitamin D for the receptor factor. I have seen people respond much more efficiently to thyroid in terms of a timeline of resolving symptoms when you augment it with vitamin D. But looking at those micronutrient deficiencies first, whether you're looking at testosterone or thyroid, should always be the first point of call, because we should always be trying to get the benefits of hormone replacement therapy without using hormone replacement therapy where possible. That's always the ideal. But magnesium and vitamin D are the most important nutrients for the thyroid. Typically, people are looking at selenium and iodine. And, I don't know about you, but I've seen hundreds, maybe thousands at this stage, of people with subclinical hypothyroidism take selenium and iodine, and I have never seen them solve the problem ever. But a good quality multivitamin would cover those bases from the foundation. But vitamin D and magnesium being suboptimal is much more prevalent than selenium and or iodine being suboptimal.
Low-dose naltrexone, do y'all have any experience with that at all?
I don't. Low-dose naltrexone has never been available for me to utilize in with my clients, because in the countries that I've worked with, the classification for low dose versus regular dosing of naltrexone is not differentiated, so it's been too difficult to acquire. A friend of mine, Justin Gross at the Restore Clinic, he's always the guy who I speak to about that. I think that it has a very interesting mechanistic application for autoimmunity and Hashimoto's. I have found that there are more root cause pathways that can be corrected and improved in Hashimoto's to bring down antibody activity, particularly things like correcting the gut health properly, not by just throwing a bunch of nonsense at it, by actually correcting the gut health, and correcting stress and lifestyle factors that can be driving up autoimmune issues. But I think that the premise of using low dose naltrexone for particularly Hashimoto's cases where the antibodies are jacked, especially if there's like a cross autoimmune condition with something like celiac or type 1 diabetes, I think that makes an enormous amount of sense, but it's not something that I would.
Gotcha. In terms of like DHEA and pregnenolone now and those aspects, what symptoms would let you realize, lead you to start maybe implementing those in a guy who's already on testosterone? And do you follow any lab markers with them?
Yeah, I'm pretty big on the lab markers, especially the DHEA. I've found that if DHEA is not low, it almost always, and there are exceptions to rules. So whenever I say always, people need to look at like the 95th confidence interval. Doesn't Exceptions don't disprove rules for people who haven't studied science before. But for the majority of cases, the vast majority, DHEA is fantastically beneficial if it is deficient. And if it's not deficient, it makes you stink and it causes acne. It also tends to have estrogenic effects. And it's interesting in terms of how it seems to drive these estrogenic effects because it is a weak estrogen, but I guess you could argue that it's an estrogen antagonist because it would outcompete estradiol and other estrogens from binding to the receptor. But it seems to convert locally to estrogen in situations in which it is not needed. And pregnenolone as well, when it's not needed, I mean, it is a pretty potent estrogen beta receptor agonist. So it doesn't surprise me when guys take these hormones and they don't, in fact, need them. They tend to get anti-androgenic effects that show up in various ways, shapes, and forms. It's very interesting when you look at studies using high dose DHEA in people who don't have deficiency. So there's studies where they look at giving people like 50 or 100 milligrams of DHEA who aren't deficient. And I'll have to pull up the exact study so I can show people this. But there's one study where more than 50% of people dropped out because it made their sweat smell revolting. And it's very interesting when more than half of participants drop out because it makes them stink. That kind of makes me laugh. But DHEA, if it's not needed, will make the skin very oily. It will tend to make people feel very wired. It has a very similar effect on a number of pathways as caffeine does. So when it is not needed, it tends to cause some benefits and some problems. But when it is needed, it is a game changer. And the most common symptom that you see in practice for low DHEA, and it's because men tend to be quite fixated on their sexual function, is that it will cause a reduction in penile sensitivity and difficulty reaching orgasm. And this is something where when guys report this, particularly when they're older, when there's more likely going to be a declining DHEA level, this to me is a immediate hallmark to look at that DHEA number and be like, if this is on the borderline, then this is likely something that is needed. With the pregnenolone, the most common symptom of deficiency that I see is that, I like to say that people feel cranked, which is kind of like if you have too much coffee in a bad way. It's like if we isolate the side effects of caffeine, not the benefits. People tend to be wired and tired. People tend to have a very overactive and racing mind where they can't focus, but they can't switch off, and they can't get going, but they can't get to bed. And it tends to make people feel very internally tortured, and the internal mental state is often quite severely insufferable to the point that a lot of people end up becoming suicidal. And I've had a lot of people who have corrected their pregnenolone deficiencies based on my educational content and reached out and shared that it's been the thing that's kind of made them choose to not make that permanent decision to a temporary problem. And that's why I'm so passionate about educating on these hormones, because when they are deficient, as I said before, nothing feels like it's quite right. And then when you correct those deficiencies, it tends to be, something that, I've had grown men in tears multiple times for the fact that it's, completely solved the issues that they've been looking to solve for many years. So yeah, they're hormones that they are life-changing and incredible, but they can also be very problematic. And one of the reasons I wrote my second book, Beyond TRT, was trying to dispel this myth that TRT shuts down pregnenolone and DHEA, and that everyone on TRT needs to take pregnenolone and DHEA because of backfilling the pathways. And I just saw this doing an immense amount of harm. And not only was this not supported by any literature or any mechanistic theory, but in practice, it was just causing a huge amount of problems.
That was going to be my next question. Do you implement it more prior to testosterone or after?
Almost always after. I mean, I do see some older guys who are like virtually no DHEA, like so low, and then their testosterone levels are like okay. So, if someone does have a primary hormone deficiency in those pathways and their testosterone is not deficient, then that would be the case that I would be looking at that. It's just that that doesn't really come up very often. Um, I do see a lot of practitioners where if testosterone is borderline, they'll start with pregnenolone and DHEA to try to avoid the need for starting TRT. I've just never seen that work, and it doesn't make much sense to me. So
I
I
haven't
know that
either.
they're part of the same, sex hormone cascade, but DHEA, it's not only an adrenal hormone, but if it is primarily an X hormone, I would say it is adrenal. So I tend to view them as separate, but also part of that interconnected pathway. So a lot of the time I'll start them all together. Um, Other times I'll start testosterone first and then bring the pregnenolone and DHEA in after. It is really case by case, but a lot of the time the benefit comes from doing everything together with these hormones. I think it just takes a bit more skill and experience to be able to do that in a way that doesn't cause problems.
Is there any way to quantify pregnenolone? Do y'all have a good lab test or any way to follow levels of them?
Yeah, it's pregnenolone's a pain in that regard, and that's why I think again a lot of people put it in the too hard basket. I work in a lot of countries that doesn't have any form of pregnenolone testing. Um, Australia used to, they got rid of it. I joke that I think it was only my clients who were using that lab test, so they just got rid of it and stopped offering it.
Yeah.
I know that you can check it in the UK. I know that there are some countries that check regular pregnenolone, not sulfate, which is like, you know, testing a moving target. That doesn't make any sense. Um, Pregnenolone sulfate is notoriously inaccurate as a serum marker. If people say estradiol is inaccurate or DHT is inaccurate, pregnenolone is inaccurate times a million compared to those. But it does become accurate when you're using exogenous supplementation because now you are measuring something that is more static. So I tend to use pregnenolone sulfate as a ballpark number to measure against. I've seen a lot of pregnenolone tests over the years because one of the things that was cool when I first did those lectures is that everyone would just email me their pregnenolone labs. So I'd just see tons of them. And
Oh,
a
nice.
lot
Yeah.
of the people who come to me for consultations these days, they tend to be troubleshooting cases, and a lot of them are pregnenolone DHEA based. So I do see a lot of pregnenolone labs, and a pregnenolone sulfate test is reliable if it's zero. Like if it comes back undetectable multiple times, that's a useful test. But if it comes back at a 30 or a 40 or a 60 or a 70, like that number will fluctuate with the wind. But once you add in exogenous supplementation, it does become more consistent. So I tend to say if pregnenolone is undetectable on repeat lab tests, it definitely warrants a trial. If pregnenolone sulfate, and again, I'm always referencing sulfate when I'm talking about pregnenolone or DHEA testing if I don't state that. But if I'm looking at a pregnenolone that's consistently under 50, to me, that warrants a trial if there are symptoms as well. If it's consistently over 50 and there are symptoms, it is more, and this is the part that's really important, and I put this in my book, and I will triple down on this statement, is that pregnenolone deficiency and chronic stress symptoms are the same. So a lot of the time, people are wanting to resolve their chronic stress issues that are lifestyle issues by taking pregnenolone. That doesn't fix it. That causes problems. But I find that progesterone is a better end marker for pregnenolone because that is the primary metabolite of exogenous pregnenolone supplementation. And when progesterone goes too high, it starts to inhibit 5-alpha reductase and has an anti-androgenic effect. This is what drives a lot of the side effects from pregnenolone. So using that as an end marker can be more useful in determining when we finish titrating the pregnenolone dose than pregnenolone sulfate itself.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for that insight. Kind of back to just a little bit of, to kind of wrap up just kind of psych and guys, um, what do you kind of would hope a guy understands about his masculinity and his biology, let's say under 30, and then the next one over 40? Any changes, or what you would hope a guy is kind of realizing about himself and working on?
It's a good question. One of the things that's interesting is working with a lot of guys kind of, let's say, over the age of like 50 or 60, because that's when you start to see more of a disparity between chronological and biological age. So it becomes very clear to people like us who see a lot of, men coming in and out of the practice, that you are absolutely the sum of your lifestyle habits. And, for example, I've seen men in their early 60s look as old as men in their 80s based on the fact that they've been consuming large amounts of alcohol for their entire life. When you see men who are in their mid 40s who've been binge drinking like a 21-year-old every weekend for their entire adult life, they have very different, everything from skin complexion to blood work to, digestive health and everything in between, than people who consistently look after themselves. And I think a lot of the time people think that we can just put off getting our shit together in those aspects. And you can, but you shouldn't, because we are either, building ourselves up or decaying. And, given the fact that we are chronologically aging inevitably, I think if people don't really focus on making self-improvement, self-development, or just preservation of general health via daily habits, if we don't make that a priority as soon as possible, the latter years of your life in terms of seeing your grandkids grow up may be more of a pipe dream than a realistic representation of reality. And for me, it's been very sad to see people who realize this when it's too late and they've kind of passed that point of no return. And, getting to your 50s or 60s and having early onset chronic disease is very, very sad. And it's very sad when people realize they've done this to themselves and they knew better and they kept doing it anyway because they thought they were the exception to the rule. They thought they were the ones who were invincible. And if you can make self-development a hobby, like if you can make it something that you enjoy and that you look forward to, or even if you go one step further and you start to take pride in the journey, not just doing it as a means to an end, that's biohacking. Like, I don't care what the new bloody research chemicals or whatever people are taking are. Like, that's not biohacking. Like, biohacking is making self-improvement a hobby, and it's making discipline something that you take pride in. And it's making all of those things meaningful and something that you take pride in. And I think that message is the same for younger or older men. It's just that it's more important for older men to implement it as soon as possible, but it's also a higher ROI for younger men to implement it because then they can practice it for longer. So, for the last 2 years, I was doing clinical reviews for my clinic in Australia where, as a health coach, I was reviewing every patient alongside the doctor and writing reports, like non-medical based reports based on the blood work and based on their questionnaire responses to say, this is the stuff that you need to start doing, this is the stuff that you need to stop doing, and this is how it's impacting your treatment, and this is how it's impacting your blood work. So I was doing like 20 or 30 of those a day for at first it wasn't that high of a volume because the clinic grew, but by the end, that was kind of the number I was looking at. And when you see that kind of volume, trends become really clear. Trends become much more clear at scale. And I think that practitioners need to start prescribing lifestyle habits, not just medications. Because if you show me someone's lifestyle habits, I can tell you how their TRT response is going to be at 3 or 6 months, and I can tell you what their blood work is going to look like. And those are the differentiators, assuming that the protocol is good. Those are the differentiators between who does well and who doesn't. And then if you extrapolate that beyond TRT, but just into general quality of life and health and well-being, it is those daily habits ultimately that impact your subjective experience of who you are and how you experience being a human. And I think that everyone who's listening to this or doing TRT or just pursuing this route of health in general, we are all just trying to improve our subjective experience of being alive. And those little things in conjunction with the right medical treatments, whether it's hormone replacement therapy or whatever else people need, testosterone is the multiplier for your daily habits. And, you can multiply zero by any number and it's still zero. It is those small things that people think aren't as important that are actually the most important. And I would encourage anyone who is having trouble with that protocol. And again, I'm kind of making the assumption that people who are listening at least have a halfway decent protocol. If people have gotten to the end of the podcast and they don't know what that is, you can email me. And if you can't afford a copy of my TRT 101 ebook, I'll be happy to send you a copy for free. But if you've got a good protocol in place and things aren't feeling right, before you start, looking at changing things or adding medications or doing this and that, just write a list of all the things that you're doing that you probably know that you shouldn't be doing, and then all the things that you're not doing that you know you should be doing, and fix that. And if you fix that and the symptoms persist, then talk to your provider about it. But we cannot solve lifestyle issues with medications and hormones and peptides and drugs. But those are a lot of the times the things that people are trying to solve for with those things.
Yeah. One last thing, just to kind of tie everything in with everything. Mindful meditation, do you recommend it? And do you have any tips to either implement it or keep doing it to work on it?
Yeah. So I was actually in a role before I was doing this professionally where I was working for a secular, so meaning not religious, mindfulness organization where we would actually teach parents and teachers how to teach it to children based on interventional research. So apologies, people,
Okay.
but it's good timing that we're about to finish. That's the first time that's ever happened. I put a new battery in my camera, so my apologies for that. So I used to teach this for a living. And the reason that I got into that role professionally was because it was something that I was so passionate about. So I've been practicing meditation since I first watched Dragon Ball Z as a kid because I was like, well, that's cool.
Yes.
Maybe this will turn me into a Super Saiyan, because I wasn't really into
Yes.
working out or training, but I was like, I could do this part. I was fortunate that I thought it was cool when I was younger, so that's what got me into it. And so I've been practicing meditation for a long time, ever since the original iPhone came out, whenever that was. I've been using the Headspace app, and I still think that's the best app for meditation. One day I'm going to have to get an affiliate code for it, but Headspace, I think, is the best. Other people prefer Sam Harris's app, whether people agree or don't agree with his political stances, but he has a very different style of meditation. His is a lot more straight to the point. Andy from Headspace is a bit more analogies and examples and a bit more wafty in a way that I think is good. So I tend to prefer the Headspace app, but it's very important if people want to get into mindfulness. If the person narrating it irritates you, it's never going to work because you're constantly going to be triggered by that. And so that's fine. So you just have to find one that works for you. So I recommend downloading both and doing like a trial of both and just seeing which one you prefer. It's like whether you prefer chocolate or vanilla ice cream. They're both good. So the most important thing that we found, and I was actually involved in an interventional trial with children with the University of Western Australia, where it was an 8-week study where they got them to do 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation a day. And they actually did MRI scans to actually measure changes in the brain. And they found that you could actually physically see a growth in the prefrontal cortex and a reduction in the amygdala. So you get a growth in the part of the brain that's responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, focus, attention. And you get a physical reduction in the size of the part of the brain that signals the adrenals to release cortisol and adrenaline. So this is what we would teach parents and basically say, this is not like a spiritual, wafty, woo-woo thing. This is real neuroscience, and this has real changes. But the part that was important, and this is the part that I wish this wasn't the case, but it is that you have to do it every day. And when it comes to mindfulness meditation, that the best way that I can describe it to people in this audience who probably know a little bit about or a lot about training is that when we look at muscle hypertrophy, it tends to be about volume and intensity over the course of the week. And that tends to be the thing that we look at, progressive overload, volume over the week, split it up how you want, that's kind of the primary metric. With mindfulness, it's more about frequency. So it's more about how often you do it. So, for example, if you meditate every day for 10 minutes, that would be better than meditating once a week for 2 hours. There's more volume doing it once a week for 2 hours, but it's about the frequency of disrupting what's called the default mode network. So basically, what we want to do is be able to disrupt the typical pattern of thinking and of the mind and of how things are working by default, to be able to train this new process of focusing on what we choose to focus our attention on. So the importance of meditation is that you develop the skill of mindfulness. So it's kind of like going to the gym gets you stronger. So meditation is like going to the gym, and then mindfulness is the skill that you get, or the outcome that you get from going to the gym. And what you are developing is the mental skill of attention. And the mental skill of attention, being able to choose what you focus on, being able to regulate your emotions and creating distance between the stimulus and the response, is one of the most important skills that you can have as an adult, because it means that you are choosing what you focus on and you are developing the skill of saying, I don't want to do this, but I need to do this. So I'm going to get it done, even though it's boring and I don't like it. And I'd rather go and do this. Or being in a situation where, something makes you angry, or it makes you upset, or it triggers you, and you're able to take a step back as an observer of the situation, take a breath, emotionally disconnect, and then choose how to respond rationally. That's not a skill that we're born with. And that's not a skill that will be retained if we don't practice that ability of focusing the mind. So I think a lot of people view mental health as something that is static. It's something that can't be changed. And that's like saying, oh, I genetically have small muscles. It's like, well, no, we know that that's not true. So you can train the mind just like you train the body. And I think if people focused at least 10% the amount on training their mind as they do training their body, they might find that their mental health is something they can work on, rather than being something that's just broken that they need to take drugs to fix.
Man, that was great. Solid insight. To kind of wrap up, I've already kept you over an hour. Where can people find you? What are you working on these days?
Yes, so you can find me on Instagram at I'm Dave Lee. I'm also Dave Lee TRT on YouTube. I recently started doing YouTube. But if you search my name and that search term on YouTube, I've got tons of podcasts and lectures and a whole bunch of really deep, long videos on a whole bunch of topics. So if people like long, in-depth discussions on things, I'm the guy for that. So you can also find me at advancedfundamentalhealth.com. I have a few very affordable ebooks I've written on there. People can also work with me on coaching if they would like. And at the moment, I am working on my own certification course. So I've been wanting to do this for a long time. I've previously been focusing on free content, masterclass series on YouTube, because I'm very passionate about information being freely available to everyone. But the thing that I am working on this year is making my own certification for practitioners, so that I can teach everyone who wants to learn exactly how everything should be done in the best possible way, and integrating all the importance of lifestyle practices and how to prescribe supplements, as well as how to properly optimize the ins and outs of delivering the best possible hormone replacement therapy protocols. So I hope to have that launched by the middle of the year. And if people want to learn more about that, they can go to the website and keep an eye on that.
Man, that's awesome. And we'll tag all these on the YouTube description and everything. But man, thank you so much for your time, your expertise. This was amazing, and I very much appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge with everybody.
Thank you so much for having me, man. And as I said previously, it was great to spend some time together at Silverback, and looking forward to seeing you there again this year, because it is the 2nd of January. So it's this year.
Yeah, this year for sure.